Hello again. Welcome back to the course Life of Christ. We're now in class 41, a two-part class that has to do with Jesus and the Sabbath. In the first part, we'll talk about the establishment of the Sabbath back in Exodus 16, and then we'll talk about how the Jews have observed the Sabbath down through the centuries, even till today. And then in the second half, we'll talk about how Jesus handled the Sabbath and what we can learn from him. So I invite you to go, first of all, to Exodus chapter 16. In Exodus 16, we've already seen this passage a few classes ago when we talked about God sending manna from heaven. And in the context of that, then as they're on the sixth day, then Moses comes to them and says, tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. So the idea is prepare today for tomorrow, because tomorrow is going to be a special day. Now, it's worth pointing out that this is while they're still in the desert on the way to Mount Sinai. They haven't even got there yet. They haven't received the 10 Commandments yet, and we know that keeping the Sabbath is one of the 10, and yet they've already begun to observe the Sabbath. So we can see how important it was from the very beginning of Israel there in the desert. Now, if you look at the Hebrew in this, I've kind of cut and pasted a section of the Hebrew text, and it reads from right to left, Shabbaton, Shabbat, Kodesh, La Yahweh. And that means a day of rest, Shabbaton, Shabbat, a Sabbath, and then Kodesh is holy, and then to Yahweh, or holy to the Lord. Now it's interesting, in English when we read it, Moses says, tomorrow is to be a day of Sabbath rest, a holy Sabbath to the Lord. But in Hebrew, it starts off with the idea of Sabbath. It says, a day of rest, a Sabbath, holy to the Lord. And so by putting it at the first part of the sentence, it gives it more emphasis and really shines a spotlight on how special this day is supposed to be, a day holy to the Lord. And it says twice the idea of Sabbath or day of rest here. And so you wonder, how is this so important to the Jews, or why? You even have different words connected to this root in Hebrew. Shabbat means to rest or to stop, to cease work. Sheva is the number 7, comes from the same consonants there. And then Shavua is the word for week. And that's the word where they get Shavuot, which is the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Tabernacles later on. And so this whole idea of once a week, once every 7 days, then you're supposed to rest. Your rest every 7, okay? And so again, you look and you say, why is this so special? Well, the Bible gives 2 reasons when you have the 2 recitations of the 10 Commandments. The first time at Mount Sinai in Exodus 20, verse 11, it says the Sabbath is blessed because God rested on the 7th day after creating the world. And so when they first got the 10 Commandments, then there was a great celebration because they wanted to remember how God had created the world. And so they took time every week to do that. Then at the second recitation of the 10 Commandments in Deuteronomy 5, this is right before they go into Canaan, and it's after 40 years have passed, and so it's a reminder because God has taken you out of Egypt, and the idea is, and now he's ready to start with you on another chapter of your history, continue to take care of you, and he wants you to remember the work that he's done among his people, okay? And so those are the 2 main reasons given in Scripture for keeping the Sabbath. And so they're told to remember the Sabbath day in Exodus 20, verse 8, again, part of that first recitation of the 10 Commandments. And so the question is, how do you remember? Because, they're not just talking about in your mind, thinking back and remembering, oh, yeah, it's the Sabbath, we have to rest. There are different things they were supposed to do to show that they remembered this day and its importance. So, for example, in Exodus 16:29, one of the rules connected to the Sabbath was not to go out on it. This is back in Exodus 16 again, where they're not supposed to go out and pick up manna, right? They're not supposed to do any kind of work. So do not go out. And the idea is don't go out to work. Remember this day. Exodus 20, verse 10, don't do any work at all, not just the people, but the animals either. So again, it's a day for rest and to think about the Lord. Exodus 31, verse 16, this rule is not just for now, but for generations to come. In other words, it's from now on. And so that's why the Jews today are still observing the Sabbath. In Exodus 35:3, there's a specific command given not to light fires, perhaps because of all the work involved in gathering wood and starting it, maybe then cooking after that, so you weren't supposed to light fires. Leviticus 25 verse 4 talks about how even the land has a Sabbath every 7 years. And so the land itself wasn't plowed or tilled, or they didn't harvest any crops every 7 years. Numbers 28 verse 9 also mentions that on the Sabbath, one of the things you're supposed to do is offer sacrifices, right? That's part of remembering the Lord. Nehemiah 10:31 and also in chapter 13:15, it talks about not buying or selling on the Sabbath. Again, don't do activities that would distract you from remembering the Lord. And then finally, in Jeremiah 17:22, it says, don't bring a load out of your houses. And so you see the commands getting more and more specific. And perhaps by Jeremiah's time, several hundred years in after this command was given, people really needed a lot of instruction on what it meant to really keep the Sabbath, because they're several hundred years later, okay? Also, there's a couple of passages in the Old Testament that talk about an ideal way to remember the Sabbath and a terrible way to remember or to act on the Sabbath. Beginning with the terrible way in Amos 8:5, part of the passage says that people were waiting on the Sabbath, basically waiting for the Sabbath to be over, and they're saying, when will the Sabbath be over that we may sell grain and market wheat? Showing that their focus was not at all on the Lord or on the Sabbath. They just wanted to get back to making more money. And so God says, that's terrible. That's not the idea of the Sabbath at all. But Isaiah 58:13 says, if you call the Sabbath a delight and the Lord's day honorable, and if you honor it by not going your own way and not doing as you please or speaking idle words, then you will find your joy in the Lord. And again, what's the focus of you during that day? It is on the Lord and on what would please him, and not on what you would rather do instead of that. Now, if you look at then the consequences of disobedience, Exodus 31 verses 14 and 15, also Exodus 35 verse 2 says, he who desecrates the Sabbath will surely die. And then you see in Numbers 15, there's actually a case of a guy who went out and collected wood on the Sabbath, and he was stoned to death. And so the Jews would look at that, and then Exodus also 31:14 says he'll be cut off from his people. So this is something to take very seriously. And so the Jews decided that they would do anything they could to avoid dishonoring the Sabbath. And they not only remembered the command and tried to do the specific things that the Bible mentioned, but they also began to kind of put a hedge around those laws so they wouldn't even get close to disobeying the laws. And so in their oral commentary on the law, which is called the Mishnah, now it's written down in a number of volumes, it lists 39 categories of work that the Jews developed based on what the law said about keeping the Sabbath. And so you can see they kind of took what was just several passages and they turned it into a whole lot of rules and commandments having to do with not working on the Sabbath. Now, the first 11 of these categories deal with making bread, things that you shouldn't do because it's work. And so 11 of the categories have to do with bread. The next 13 deal with clothing, like tying or untying, sewing 2 stitches. They had certain limits, very minimal limits for what you could do in those areas. And again, the whole idea is don't go too far or else that'll be working and you'll disobey the Lord, and the consequences for disobedience are serious. Then the next 7 categories are those required to work with leather, like killing animals or skinning them or whatever. And so again, just putting real strict limits on anything to do so you won't even start, you won't even get close to working. And then the last 8 deal with building a house, demolishing or starting or extinguishing fires, even writing and erasing plans, even the number of letters that you could write. So 39 categories of work, many having to do with even the construction and use of the tabernacle, which was important in itself. Now, the question then is, what happens today? How do religious Jews, I know there's a lot of secular Jews that don't pay attention to it, but how do religious Jews that still care about observing the Sabbath act, and what do they avoid? And so, for example, you have Jews avoiding doing business, and that was a pretty clear connection with the one about Amos, about buying and selling wheat. Driving a car, shopping, using the telephone, mowing the yard or working in the garden, washing clothes, turning off or on anything using electricity like lights or radio or TV or computers, air conditioning, clocks, even elevator buttons. And you say, surely not. Surely that's like too strict. But if you go to Israel and if you go to any buildings that have elevators like hotels, for example, you'll see signs like this. And if you're between about sundown on Friday and sundown on Saturday, then the elevator rules about the Sabbath go into effect. They call it Shabbat. And so you'll go into a hotel and they'll say, if you are not an observant Jew, you might not want to take the Shabbat elevator because you see it right here from this picture, all of the buttons are pressed. It's like a little kid got in and punched every button he could, but it stays that way all day. So that the observant Jews that want to keep every rule, they'll take that elevator so they don't have to push any buttons because that would be work on the Sabbath. That way they can get off at any floor without pushing a button. And so you see the detail that they go to. Here's other examples here. You have different kinds of ovens that have what they call a Sabbath mode, so that you can prepare your meal beforehand, the day before, and then put it in Sabbath mode, and then it'll kick on and cook at the right time. And that way all you have to do is take the food out and then you just eat the food. So you don't work on the Sabbath. And you also have the same kind of modes on like washing machines and dishwasher. Again, you see the Sabbath mode button right here. Okay. And there's even a sweatshirt that I saw kind of liked Sabbath mode on, even for people. I'm in Sabbath mode. And that's actually a fairly good idea. I like that one there. Now, you also have some extreme cases of avoiding the law or protection, and we've mentioned like automatic clocks that could be used to turn on lights, or the Sabbath ovens. We already mentioned those. But there's other things like, for example, they'll unscrew the light in the refrigerator the day before the Sabbath so that it doesn't come on when the door opens, or turn on the fan. Okay, just again, a way of not even coming close to doing any work on the Sabbath. You can't take things from a private place to a public place more than 2 meters, okay? Because that would be work. That would be carrying things. This even includes if you have things in your pocket or in your hand or gum in your mouth, that would be carrying a load from one place to another, and that would be work. You can't push a baby carriage. You can't look in a mirror because you might be tempted to brush your hair, and that would break the law because that would be work. But then there's a major exception here that helps Jewish families do what needs to be done, what's unavoidable on the Sabbath, and that is that they can employ what they call a Shabbos goy. In other words, a goy is like a Gentile person, and so that would be like a Sabbath Gentile person, so that they could come to your house, and all the things that you're not supposed to do as an observant Jew on the Sabbath, then you can have this Gentile do for you, right? And they probably pay the person to do it. But the idea is the Gentile doesn't have to observe the Sabbath, and so he's not breaking any religious law for himself, and then he can help you keep the law, okay? And so there's families that have the Shabbos goy, which I think that's kind of odd. You would wonder if they think, don't you want this person to become observant just like you, instead of making him work on the Sabbath? But evidently that's they've already thought about that and decided that's okay. Another thing that they mentioned is you cannot move mukse, all right? And basically these are just different little objects. Like, for example, you can't move an object like a rock or a plant or a flower in a jar or raw food, or a button that fell on the floor. These are some examples of muktzeh. And you can't move it with your hand or even indirectly with a broom. Okay, you're supposed to just leave it there. Even valuable objects like cameras, if you leave it somewhere, or a passport or birth certificate, papers, you're not even supposed to move the objects that fall in this category as well. Okay, but it says you can move them in an unusual fashion, not a common fashion like your hand or a broom, but an unusual fashion like with your mouth or teeth, or with your elbow, or even by blowing on them. Okay. And so you look at all these things. You start with the Jewish law, which already seems pretty restrictive. Then you go to the categories of work, and then you see how even those have been elaborated more and more through the years, so that people can do as much as they can to feel like that they are not only fulfilling the law, but even the spirit of the law. And there's really, I guess, two reactions to it. One is that you can respect it highly, that they care enough about following this law that they want to even go to extreme lengths to avoid disobeying the law or dishonoring God. And in that way, I think it's admirable, because I do know some Jews, and I know that many of them are very sincere, and they want to honor the Lord and do as much as they can to obey. And so I respect that. I'm happy for them to do that. I don't have any problem with it. The other reaction is really the other extreme, where it's like, well, this is ridiculous. How can you believe that God would care that much about you picking up a button on the Sabbath, or that you couldn't punch a button in the elevator on the Sabbath? How in the world would God consider that disobedient or disrespectful? And surely God is a bigger God than that, that he would, let you have more freedom on the seventh day, to worship him and to honor him. And so it's kind of the other extreme, where you make fun of people that do this. Okay. And, I think, okay, well, it's easy for us to pick on these examples and make fun. And yet then we've found examples of that in the church today as well through the years. So we've tried to honor what the Bible has said, and we've tried to follow it in every detail as much as we can, because we want to be obedient and show our respect and our love for the Lord. But it's led to some ridiculous examples also for us of things that we've argued about, things that have divided churches, just because we're trying to kind of go to an extreme. For example, there was controversy for a long time about whether women should wear veils or not, in worship especially. And most people today think, well, that's not an issue. That was cultural back then. But for a long time, that was a big deal for a lot of people. There are churches who separated men and women in worship because they didn't want them to be distracted at all during worship. And so men would sit on one side of the aisle and women on another. I've been in a church that had that rule and saw the sign where they separated it, or where they'd have the men on the floor and the women and the children upstairs in a loft or something like that. There are churches that have been divided over not supporting orphanages or missionary societies. They're thinking that's an example of cooperation between churches, and each church should be autonomous, and so we shouldn't cooperate in any way. And you think, wait, this is for orphans, which the Bible supports helping, and it's for missionary societies, and Jesus says, go into all the world. How can you possibly be against that? And yet some people have been. There's churches that are divided over not having a kitchen or having a kitchen in the church building. There's churches that argue about whether or not you can use any part of the church offering for non-Christians, because they say, no, it says you're supposed to take care of the household of faith first. And so they say that means we can't help any non-Christians. And again, churches divide over this. Or others say, in this church, we only use the King James Version. And some people that are just a little bit ridiculous say, because, we know that it's the one Jesus and Paul used. And of course, that's obviously wrong. But again, there's been churches that have gotten upset or even divided when someone used a different version of the Bible. And so in our own way, in our own issues, we can be just as extreme as the Jews were about the Sabbath, because we're human beings. And if you don't understand what the real purpose behind a rule is, then it's easy to finally lose the heart of the rule, the spirit of the rule, and end up far away from what God originally intended. And that's kind of what happens in some ways with the Sabbath. It began as a way to honor and remember the Lord and ended up kind of distorted and forgotten. So in the next part of the class then, we're going to look at how Jesus handled the Sabbath and the principles that he gave us today that still apply about it. We'll see you next time.